This wedding photograph was taken in 1878. The bride is in white, gloved hands folded over a small bouquet. The groom stands at her side, one arm just touching the back of her chair. Their faces are calm, almost peaceful. At first glance, it looks like any other Victorian wedding portrait, stiff, formal, unsmiling. It sat for more than a century in a cardboard box in a studio archive. On the back, in faded ink, someone had written, "Thomas Hale and Sarah Cooper, June 1878. Married in death." When the image was finally scanned and examined in detail, archivists realized something that earlier generations had quietly chosen to ignore. The hands are too slack, the eyes not quite focused. The skin, even under the soft retouching, has that unmistakable flatness. By the time this wedding photograph was taken, both the bride and the groom had already been dead for days. And yet their families dressed them, posed them, exchanged rings over their bodies, and paid a photographer to record them as man and wife. This is the story of the double post-mortem wedding of 1878. Welcome to Veins of Darkness. To make any sense of what happened, we have to step back into the world that created this photograph. The year is 1878. Britain is deep in the High Victorian period. Railways bind the country together, factories blacken the skies of industrial towns, telegraph wires hum above hedgerows. Our story unfolds in a market town on the edge of the Midlands, the kind of place with a single church spire, a square lined with shops and lanes of small brick houses radiating outward. Here, life is governed by the parish calendar. Baptisms, weddings, and burials mark the passage of time, written into thick registers by a vicar whose ink-stained hands smell faintly of candle wax and damp paper. Weddings were among the few days when ordinary people could step briefly out of their working clothes and into something like a dream. A typical Victorian wedding portrait followed a script. Bride seated or standing, often in a white or light-colored dress if the family could afford it, the groom in his best black suit, perhaps a spray of orange blossom in the bride's hair, a symbolic wreath of chastity and hope. The couple weren't expected to smile. Photography still required several seconds of absolute stillness, and besides, solemnity was considered more dignified. Rings were exchanged, vows said, registers signed, and then, often later that day, the trip to the photographers. But death was never far away. Disease, factory accidents, carriage mishaps, and the ever-present risk of the railways meant that the same families walking up the church path in white could find themselves walking back in black within months or even days. In that world, it was not unusual for the dead to be photographed. Post-mortem portraits of infants, much-loved wives, even patriarchs laid out in their coffins were a way of holding onto a face that would otherwise disappear. What was unusual, almost unheard of, was what the Hale and Cooper families chose to do in the summer of 1878. They decided to go ahead with a wedding that fate had already cancelled. The parish registers for St. Mark's Church show the couple clearly. On the page for marriages intended in June 1878, we find Thomas Edward Hale, bachelor, age 27, occupation ironmonger's assistant. Sarah Ann Cooper, spinster, age 24, occupation dressmaker. Banns published May 19th, 26th, and June 2nd. Their addresses are only a few streets apart. In a town this size, they would have known each other for years. Thomas works behind the counter in an ironmonger's shop on the square, selling nails by the pound and lamps by the dozen, hands stained with oil. Sarah takes in sewing, her initials hidden in hems all over town. One of her specialties, neighbors later recall, is wedding dresses. We can imagine the months leading up to June. Sarah quietly putting aside the best scraps of lace for herself, Thomas saving shillings for a decent suit. The Bams read out in church 3 Sundays in a row, their names spoken into the echoing nave for all to hear.
The date is set for June 18, 1878, a Tuesday. A modest weekday wedding, typical for their class. On the page after their banns, the vicar has already drawn a faint pencil line where their marriage entry will go. It will never be filled in. Because 4 days before the wedding, on June 14th, Thomas and Sarah are involved in an accident. Here, for the first time, the parish records give way to the newspapers. In the local weekly, a small column titled "Melancholy Occurrence" reports that a cart carrying Thomas and Sarah, along with Sarah's younger brother, overturned on a narrow bridge outside town. The horse was spooked by a passing steam engine. The cart's wheel caught the low stone wall. It tipped. Its occupants were thrown. The brother, miraculously, escaped with broken ribs. Thomas and Sarah were not so lucky. By the time help arrived, both lay motionless on the riverbank below, clothes darkened with water and blood. The inquest, held 2 days later in the back room of a public house, records the cause of death for both as fracture of the skull, accidental. Witnesses attest that there was no drunkenness, no recklessness, just bad timing and a frightened animal. The coroner writes, in his neat hand, verdict for each, accidental death. The age lines are blunted, 27 and 24. On the same day the inquest concludes, the vicar draws a second, heavier line through the penciled space in the marriage register. The wedding is off. Or it should have been. What happens next is pieced together from 3 kinds of documents: the burial register, a studio daybook, and a letter written years later by Sarah's younger sister. First, the burials. In the register for St. Mark's, under June 1878, we read, June 20th, Thomas Edward Hale, from High Street, age 27. June 20th, Sarah Ann Cooper, from Mill Lane, age 24. 2 burials on the same day. The margin bears an unusual note squeezed between the lines in the vicar's shaky script. Bodies presented in nuptial attire at family's insistence. Service modified. Nuptial attire. Wedding clothes. Somewhere between the inquest and the graveside, both families made a choice. Sarah is laid out in the white dress she had sewn for her wedding. Her mother arranges her veil, smooths the needles of orange blossom in her hair, presses a small bouquet into her folded hands. Thomas is dressed in the black suit he had ordered specially, stiff collar straightened, waistcoat buttoned, hair combed as if he could sit up and smooth it himself. But dressing their dead children as bride and groom is not enough. In a letter written decades later to a cousin, Sarah's sister, Mary, recalls those days as a confused grief when mother would not hear of them going into the earth unwed. Mary writes, she said, "He promised before God and man to have her, and he shall have her, if only in the eyes of heaven." Father Hale said much the same. They would have the parsons speak over them together as if it were their day, no matter what the book allowed. The book is the Book of Common Prayer, which has specific rules about who may be married and how. The vicar, faced with two families united in this determination, finds himself in an impossible position. He cannot, according to canon law, marry the dead. A marriage requires consent, intention, a living man and woman standing before him. To pronounce the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," over corpses would be, in the eyes of the church, meaningless at best and blasphemous at worst. But he also cannot ignore the rawness in front of him. Two coffins, two sets of parents, a room full of relatives who had already baked cakes, sewn dresses, perhaps even written to distant relations about the upcoming wedding. So he does something awkward and human and theologically untidy. On the evening before the scheduled burial, at the Hale house where both bodies have been brought, perhaps because it is larger, perhaps because it is neutral ground, he agrees to hold a kind of blessing ceremony.
Sarah is laid on a couch, dressed as a bride. Thomas is propped in a chair beside her, ring placed on his stiff finger, a sprig of her bouquet tucked into his lapel. Their hands are arranged so that their fingers just touch. The vicar reads some of the marriage service, the parts about love and commitment, not the legal formulas, and then some of the burial service. He commends them jointly to God. And then, crucially for our story, someone says, "We should have their likeness, as we meant them to be." Enter the photographer. In town, there is one main studio, J.K. Lister, photographic artist. His premises are on the square above a draper's shop. His daybook for June 1878 still survives in a county archive. On the page for June 19th, an unusually long entry stands out. Hale, Cooper families, special group, 2 full figures, note, subjects deceased, to be arranged as at nuptials. Lister had done post-mortem photography before. It was part of his trade. He would bring his camera to a house, set it up in the best-lit room, and photograph an infant in a crib or an old man in his coffin. But this request is unprecedented. Not a simple mourning portrait, but a staged wedding. He brings his equipment, camera, tripod, glass plates, a portable backdrop, to the Hale house. He finds Thomas and Sarah arranged as described, she in her gown and veil, he seated upright, both pale and still. The furniture has been pushed back to make space. Family members stand against the wall, watching. There would have been practical difficulties. Dead bodies are heavy and resistant to posing. Their joints, depending on how long they have been gone and how they've been kept, may be stiff. The head tends to loll if not supported. Lister solves some of this by using props he already has. He brings in a sturdy chair with a straight back and props Thomas firmly in it. A stand, a headrest, normally used to keep living sitters from moving, is positioned behind his neck to hold his head upright. Sarah, being lighter, is seated in another chair close beside him, then turned slightly so that her shoulder rests against his arm. Cushions hidden under her dress help her sit naturally. Their hands are arranged so that their fingers just touch. Someone slips the wedding rings they were meant to exchange onto their fingers. The bouquet is replaced into Sarah's hands. Lister hangs a neutral backdrop behind them so that the chaotic reality of the room, hastily moved furniture, grieving relatives, won't intrude into the frame. He opens the curtains as far as they will go to admit as much daylight as possible. At last, he steps behind the camera. On the finished photograph, we see the result. Thomas sits, Sarah beside him.
Her head tilts just slightly against his shoulder, as if in shy affection. His eyes appeared to gaze straight ahead. Hers seem modestly downcast. But when the image is enlarged, the truth shows through the illusion. The eyes are wrong. Lister has retouched them, a common practice with post-mortem portraits. On the negative, their eyelids are fully closed, the globes beneath sunken. On the print, he's gone in with a fine pencil to add a dark crescent where the iris would be, a lighter spot to suggest a catchlight. It fools the casual glance, but not a modern, magnified one. Their skin, carefully lit and then smoothed in the print, lacks the tiny irregularities of living flesh. The shadows around the nostrils are too stark. The lips, while gently closed, have that almost waxen line. Their hands, though linked, do not show the subtle push and pull of mutual grip. Thomas's fingers rest under Sarah's. They do not press back.
Behind Sarah's veil, if you look closely, you can see the blurred outline of a support stand. To the families who receive the mounted card a week later, none of this matters. On the front, they see what they wanted, a wedding portrait. Their children, posed as bride and groom, united at last. The picture is placed on mantelpieces, tucked into prayer books, perhaps copied and sent to relatives, with a note explaining that, though the day was lost, we had them joined before the Lord. On the back, in a hand that is probably Mary Cooper's, someone writes, "Thomas and Sarah, wed June 1878, after the Lord took them." Decades pass. Houses are cleared. The photograph makes its way, eventually, into a box of old studio samples donated when Lister's business is sold off. The context, the accident, the inquest, the improvised ceremony, is forgotten. Until a historian, trawling through records of Victorian photography, notices the odd phrase, "subjects deceased," to be arranged as at nuptials in Lister's 1878 daybook, and decides to see if any matching print survives. When she opens the archive box and turns over the card marked Thomas Hale and Sarah Cooper, June 1878, married in death, the pieces fall together. The bands with the cross-hatched line, the double burial in wedding clothes, the daybook entry, the retouched eyes. What had been, to generations of casual viewers, a slightly stiff but otherwise unremarkable wedding portrait is revealed as something else entirely. A double post-mortem wedding photograph. We are left with the question that haunts so many cases we look at on this channel. Why? Why go to such lengths? Why dress two corpses, persuade a reluctant clergyman, pay a photographer, and construct a ritual that satisfies neither the strict letter of church law nor the cold clarity of fact? Grief never exists in a vacuum. It is shaped by culture. Victorian Britain was steeped in the language of romantic tragedy. Newspapers and penny novels alike were filled with stories of lovers separated by death, of brides of the grave, of men dying on the eve of marriage, and women wasting away of sorrow. Most of that was fantasy, consumed by people whose lives were less dramatic. For the Hale and Cooper families, in June 1878, it became an unwanted reality. A double funeral is almost too much to bear. Two young people, on the cusp of an ordinary happiness, cut down together. There is terror in randomness, in the sense that it could have been avoided by leaving 5 minutes earlier or later, by choosing a different road. To fight that terror, people look for patterns, for meaning, for ways to impose order on chaos. By insisting on a wedding in death, however messy the theology, Thomas's and Sarah's parents could tell themselves a story in which their children were not simply victims of a skittish horse,
but a couple joined in a different way. The photograph, with its careful staging and its little lie of lifelike eyes, becomes the physical anchor for that story. For us, seeing it now, once we know what we're looking at, it is unsettling. We're used to wedding photos as celebrations of life, of beginnings. The idea that both smiling figures in a frame might in fact be dead feels like a violation of that category. But to dismiss the image purely as morbid is to miss what it meant to them. It is love distorted by loss. It is denial captured on card. It is also a reminder that photographs do not always show us the truth. They show us what someone, at some moment, needed the truth to look like. Somewhere, perhaps in a box in another archive, there may be more portraits like this. Couples who never made it to the aisle, but were posed as if they had. Families who edited reality with lace, flowers, and a photographer's pencil. Most of the time, we will never know. But every so often, when a ledger survives, when a cryptic note like "subjects deceased" surfaces, we catch a glimpse into that darker use of the camera. The wedding photo, where both bride and groom were dead, is one of those rare cases where the veil lifts. Thank you for joining us on this descent into Victorian grief. If this story has made you look twice at old wedding photographs, if you'll wonder now whether every calm face you see was truly alive, subscribe to Veins of Darkness for more journeys into history's strangest medical and photographic mysteries. Until the next macabre tale, stay curious about the darkness.